You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
So we're recording. Are you good?
Yes.
Okay, good. Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast starring myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We're recording this for the benefit of my son and Jake's grandson, Ben, but we know there's a great Star Trek fan base out there that loves talking about the show, so we're putting these all up on Netflix for free. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you?
I'm doing great. I actually love the episode we're talking about a lot. I think it's one of the better episodes in the first season of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Tonight we're reviewing Conspiracy from Star Trek: The Next Generation Season 1, Episode 24, which debuted on May 9th, 1988. What do you think of this episode?
I think it's not a it's not a real complex story, but it's a good story. And we've talked about this before, that since we've all seen all these different emanations of Star Trek, we know that they sometimes will put something into a storyline of an episode that sets up future episodes. And I think this might be the first one where we had back during Coming of Age, Lieutenant Commander Remick and Admiral Quinn, and this is only a couple episodes ago, and now they're back. And when you give the listeners the summary of what the episode is about, at the very end of Coming of Age, Quinn says some things like, Jim, something's going on. Just
Jean-Luc Picard.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that he tells Picard that something.
Folks at home, we were just talking about Jim Kirk in the original series, so there's
Right.
a reason for the crossover.
Right. So that Admiral Quinn was telling Picard, there's something strange. You need to keep your radar up and so forth. So I will stop there and let you talk a little bit about what this episode is about and set it up.
Yeah. So, like you said, you put it very well. It's a continuation of the episode Coming of Age, which features the return of both Admiral Quinn and Commander Remick. As you noted, Quinn made comments in Coming of Age of something within Starfleet that threatened to undo the work I think since the beginning of the
Yes, that's right.
organization.
Yeah.
But the thing is, we really don't have any sort of follow up to Coming of Age until this episode. So the Enterprise D is en route to Pacifica for a scientific mission. Once again,
Yes.
Once again, they are looking forward to shore leave, including what Counselor Troy mentions many times as a moonlight swim in the waters of Pacifica. It seems like there's always kind of a shore leave aspect to the places that they're being assigned, and it kind of makes me wonder, later on in this episode when Data starts analyzing all of these different movements. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting ahead. So, as the crew's talking about what they're going to be doing during their shore leave on Pacifica, which seems to be a water-based planet, they receive a code 47, which is meant for a commanding officer's eyes only. So, asleep in his quarters, Jean-Luc Picard is awoken by Commander Riker, who tells his captain there's a code 47. Jean-Luc Picard receives it, only to discover that it's from a Captain Walter Keel. Yeah, Walker Keel, who is not only an old friend of Jean-Luc Picard's, and also Beverly Crusher, as we later find out, but also the captain of the Ambassador class USS Horatio. Keel asks Picard to a secret rendezvous in the abandoned mining colony of Ditalix B. Even though he won't mention what is the matter, the severity of it convinces Picard to follow his old friend to this mining planet. So that's really kind of where everything sets up. We later arrive to the planet and discover that three other ships are in orbit, um, including the USS Horatio under Walker Keel. I want to get all the captains because we may not mention them again, but let's see. Yes, so when they go down to Ditalix B, Picard meets Walker Keel, Captain Trilo Scott, who is apparently the fastest appointed captain in Federation history, and a Captain Rix, who Picard says he met recently and briefly at a conference. So, we really haven't had any sort of um, continuation coming of age into this episode conspiracy. But one thing that I think the episode nails very well early on is the tone of foreboding, kind of the sense of anxiety. I think, one thing we've mentioned in previous episodes now is the soundtrack or the music that some of these episodes are set to. There's multiple instances where um, they kind of have. I don't know the instrument. I think it might be a cello, but they kind of have this movement where it's kind of like this boom, and there's just this sense of kind of like foreboding that comes into the episode, especially when Captain Picard finally beams down to Federation headquarters back on Earth. I just wanted to ask you what do you think of the general tone of the episode? And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today kind of revolves around conspiracies because, like you said, in the opening of the episode, this is a more simple narrative with a lot less um, ancillary storytelling of other characters outside of it. It really is a kind of by the books thriller
Mm-hmm.
in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So
Um,
I'll give you the floor here.
yeah, one comment I want to make is I can't remember one of the captains' name who ended up at the meeting on Ditalix B, but it's the first time we've seen a commanding officer of a Starfleet vessel that's actually an alien. It's not human.
True.
So that's just an interesting point I just thought of. Um, I think in this episode, and actually the next, and something we've seen in the past, um, Picard takes a very cautious, scientific, somewhat almost overly cautious approach to making decisions about things. Um, Riker and people like, well, Riker to some degree works, responds very immediately to things. Let's go to red alert now. Let's arm the weapons. Worf does that. And Picard always, slows people down a bit, says, before we make a decision, let's make sure we have all of the information. And he does that here because, he goes and has the meeting. He listens to what um, um, Walter Keel says because he knows him. He has no reason to distrust him. But he doesn't see any empirical evidence that there really is something wrong going on. Then, they continue on, and the first piece of hard evidence that um, Picard receives that says, something serious is going on is the destruction of the ratio.
Right.
And that causes him to decide, well, we need to go back to Earth, back to Starfleet headquarters to find out what is going on. And one of the interesting things in this episode of what we've talked about the last episode is how data is such a good resource for Picard because,
His trump card in a way.
yeah, that's the term you use where Picard assigned data um, the task of, very quickly, which data was capable of reviewing, for the last
6
several
months
months,
of
Starfleet commands to see if there's any patterns.
correct.
And data after he does that says, yes, there are some changes and, it's irregular communication. It's the same, it's not the same as it was previous to this 6 months. So additional evidence that something is going on. So again, that reinforces Picard's decision that we need to go to Earth and go to Starfleet headquarters to investigate.
So some interesting things to dig out of there. It seems like the decision to go back to Earth is done relatively quick, and in addition is the actual trip back to Earth itself. It seems odd to me that if um Picard suddenly turned the flagship of the Federation away from his assignment from Pacifica to Ditalic Speed, okay, maybe there's something that Picard is investigating. If I'm Starfleet Command at home, I'm like, okay, it's just Jean-Luc Picard being Jean-Luc Picard. He'll have a good reason for this, and we'll have a fun report. I would think that if I was at Starfleet Command and I knew that there had been all of these command changes, and all of a sudden the flagship just suddenly shows up at the front door, I think that they would just know like well in advance that they were incoming, you know? It just seems strange to me that no one is, there's been 6 months of all these strategic essentially troop movements and command structure changes by these kind of parasitic aliens, but there's basically no security paid to the idea that, like, someone might show up out of nowhere, and then when someone finally does show up out of nowhere, they're truly kind of surprised by it. I'm just a little surprised by
Yeah.
the hole in the story here.
Yeah, I think you've identified a hole in the story. I think it's one of those things where to make the story work, you have to almost do, kind of create that hole
Yeah,
because we don't know how far Italics B is from Earth and whether, even at warp 8, whether it would take them 4 days or 8 weeks to get back to Earth. And so that brings up the issue of, well, if it took them days or weeks or even a month to get back to Earth, there would be things happening,
right.
between during that time. So I think that you've identified, a hole in the story that they just had to put in there to make it work.
Well, in some ways, like, I think it can be written off to. I think captains are given a certain amount of permission and leeway
Mm-hmm.
out there in space when they're controlling their own vessels. Because if we think about the show just from the narrative structure of every episode, if you held to account how many times the Enterprise diverts from its orders or diverts from course to investigate something out of the blue, you know, essentially they're never doing their actual jobs, it seems.
Right.
Because some of these diversions to investigate things that kind of come out of the blue that make up these shows, like you said, how many days does it really take to get from Pacifica to Earth or from Ditalic Speed to Earth?
Mm-hmm.
If it takes 7 days, that's 7 days they've wasted not following their orders. You would think that, at some point the Federation would be like, hey guys, we have these things that you need to do too. Um, an, I think another interesting point that you bring up about Data, and there's a really humorous instance where
Mm-hmm.
Data kind of does his typical run on shtick and the computer stops him. I think it's a very kind of it's a good breaking of the fourth wall moment where Data
Mhm.
kind of realizes, um, I think there's kind of something written against me
Right.
in the story.
Yeah. I think he
Um,
says something. He's talking to himself, and the computer answers him. He says, I wasn't talking to you in this. I was talking to myself.
yeah.
So it's again one of those little small events where Data realizes his humanness.
I wonder, it's an interesting notion of, um, something that we'll be dealing with in the future. Can a if an artificial intelligence really is kind of on our level or equal to kind of the human capacity, would it have the ability to daydream?
Oh, well, that goes back to that question's been asked before because in Stanley Kubrick's 2001, as Dave is
Right?
turning off the memory banks to Hal before Hal sort of loses consciousness, he says, Dave, will I dream? And Dave says, I don't know how.
Yeah.
Right.
I also think of Blade Runner.
I've never seen Blade Runner, so I can't
Really,
comment on.
you've never
No,
seen Blade
no,
Runner?
I've never seen Blade Runner.
I think it's on Amazon. You should go watch it. I
Mm-hmm,
think you'll like
mm-hmm.
it. It's a good Harrison Ford film at the very
Right.
least. Um, I think it says something interesting that Data has these moments of, he's always writing these subroutines in these programs, kind of like to create small talk or do,
Mm-hmm.
very intricate human social things. But it seems naturally that his programming is developing these kind of little quirks
Mm-hmm.
that allow him to do very human behaviors. And it's interesting if you think about, his creator, uh,
Nooning's song soon.
Union Sung. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, if you think about what Sung like has achieved here, like Sung created a positronic brain and a positronic matrix that basically allows Data to be. But he's also now created this organism that is able to go so far outside the bounds of simple programming that, it is kind of miraculous that Data is able to, have this moment of, just kind of musing to himself about things.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
it really is a huge kind of leap forward, not only for the character, and I never really appreciated this moment until I think really sitting down to, study these episodes in detail. One thing that I find interesting, and it may be another hole, and you know, the USS Horatio is an ambassador class, which is a rather large vessel. I looked this up. The Enterprise C is actually an ambassador class of vessel that we see later on in the episode Yesterday's Enterprise, which I think is 2 or 3 seasons from now.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, sorry. Um, but just like the Enterprise suddenly showing up on the front door of Earth, it seems odd to me that you would have the explosion of the USS Horatio kind of not stop everything dead in its, dead in everyone's tracks for a moment. It kind of seems to be one of those things where it's like, well, they blew up and then Starfleet kind of keeps going on.
Well, there's one thing that could be part of the deeper conspiracy, since I think it becomes obvious toward the end of the episode that when they had the meeting on Ditalics B, there was they were infiltrated. That Captain Scott was probably already taken over by one of the alien
Right.
um, uh, parasites. So after
And she's the
what
captain of a frigate, and
a frigate,
for
right?
what just for reference for those at home, a frigate is kind of a lighter combat vessel within our navy.
Right. Sure.
So,
Yeah.
it's good that you're mentioning this because I've always assumed that like it was her that destroyed the Horatio.
It's not said, but I think what happened is, since this mother organism and its parasitic babies or whatever, I wonder if they had some sort of um, combined consciousness. Um, so it could have been a plan that after Walter Keel uh, brought Picard into the loop about his concerns, and Captain Stout was down there, that she destroyed the Horatio, realizing that that would most likely get Picard involved, and that they really wanted Picard to come back to Earth
Right.
because they wanted then to infect him so that
Right.
he could be part of their cabal. And, the Enterprise was the flagship and so forth. And so, when the Enterprise arrives at Earth and Picard, beams down, they're very gracious to him, but obviously things aren't right because just that there are so few people in Starfleet headquarters, and he immediately has his guard up even more about what is going on.
Well, one thing that we should mention, you, you know, what has happened at Starfleet is that this kind of organism was discovered on an uninhabited planet by a Federation survey team, and they never actually really lay down or give exact detail about where it was found, just kind of far out in our galaxy. And one thing that this organism has is that it kind of binds to the sun. It seems like it binds to the brainstem, and you can tell that it has inhabited a human
Right.
host by a small kind of blue gill or spike that I think it kind of protrudes
Yeah, it
out
comes out of
from.
the yeah. It's kind of like what if you get a botfly uh, uh, larvae. If you
Yeah,
go to the tropics and you get bit by the fly and it lays an egg under your skin, and then as the larvae grows, it actually will protrude so that you can get oxygen and so on. I think
yeah,
that's how it works, and that's the same thing. The other thing I made a note of thinking about the gill, and they show at one point Dr. Crusher finds out that these smaller, like scorpion like
hmm
organisms, almost more like crayfish actually,
yeah.
um,
I thought they looked a lot like crayfish.
that they're attached, to the base of the brain, to the like the almost the brainstem and so forth. It reminded me of a film from 1959 called The Tingler, where they had a similar thing where a creature similar to that the story, it's kind of a science fiction horror story where
Hmm.
everybody supposedly has this cells or this parasite in them that feeds on human fear. And in
Ooh.
this story, people are scared, purposely scared and so forth, so that the tingler takes them over and they do evil things and so on. Vincent Price was in the movie even.
Ooh,
So you can
legendary.
tell, yeah, you can tell how scary this movie was.
I have to ask you, way back in the recording of this show, I think to the very first episode, I asked you about your fandom as it pertains to science fiction, and you've kind of been a science fiction fan all your life. Growing up, you mentioned The Tingler, which is I think you said a 1959 film.
Right.
Um, what was the kind of science fiction you had available? Because to my generation, it seems like there was always science fiction, but then there was like Star Wars, and then everything changes. But before that, what was the kind of science fiction you had growing up besides TV? Like, did you have a lot of movies that came out that were science fiction, or
There were I can remember, I think the first science fiction I can really remember was like in the 60s. And I don't know whether they were contemporary or not, with Star Trek and Lost in Space.
Right. Lost in
Prior to
Space.
that, there were movies. I mean, and I think 1951 was The Day the Earth Stood Still,
Mm-hmm.
which was made when really concern really cropped up about flying saucers. That was 4 years after the Roswell incident. There were some other movies. I remember one movie I watched. I forget what it was. It scared the hell out of me when I was a little kid. It was about these Martians came and they really looked funny and they were ship bedded in the earth and it was someplace out in the Midwest in Missouri or Iowa. And the Martians were implanting these little microchips in people and making them do evil things. And this little boy was, you know, um,
Maybe that's where Bill Gates got the idea.
was upset and it was really weird because he woke up and he thought it was a big dream, and then the ship
Didn't.
burst out of the earth and went up to the sky. And it's like I just remember that it scared me a lot. It was
Yeah.
in black. It was in black and white even.
Ooh, I
So
could.
I can't remember. And then of course the only in the 52 through 54 something, which I watched when I was very young on television, was Rocky Jones Space
Mhm.
Ranger. I can't remember much more science fiction than that. Uh, there are probably some other space alien films, but I can't remember anything on television until the mid 60s with Star Trek and My Favorite Martian, which was a comedy, of course,
Mhm.
and Lost in Space. And there may have been some cartoons like, and I don't know, again, I don't know what those years were. There was one called Space Ghost,
Oh yeah, Space Ghost.
Space Ghost. Um,
Yeah, the immortal Space Ghost.
right.
It's just interesting that you mention all that because I think that there is I think science fiction means so many things to different generations. And for us, I'm from the generation that kind of grew up with it from the get go as something that was just kind of our cultural milieu. And I think it's interesting for you that you're of the age that you were able to actually see these things come before they were kind of household things. In terms of, where you were you know, where you were in your younger days and as a youth growing up, in terms of where science fiction was then to where science fiction is now in our culture, how big has the change been and what was the biggest part of the change that has kind of surprised you? I know we're
I,
kind of getting away from the
yeah,
episode, but this is
I think that over the years, after World War II, and with each decade, that it was basically that uh, technological advancements and the science related to them really have grown in almost an exponential fashion.
hmm
So that there was a sense that some ideas that were presented in science fiction, give it 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, they become real.
hmm
I mean, the concept of lasers,
hmm
the whole, you know, kind of ingest retrospective of William Shatner having a show that Star Trek invented the future. Because, if you look at the communicators that they used in the original series, they're very similar to, flip phones
hmm
and cellular phone tech uh, uh, technology. Um, some of the fact that you had spacecraft that could fly into orbit and then land again with the space shuttle and that sort of thing. And the other thing I think we talked about is that Rocky Jones, actually in the early 50s, those rockets would take off, and when they would come back to Earth, they would land just like the booster, the first stage booster of the Falcon rocket lands.
right. You know, I think it's something to see. And, growing up as a Star Trek fan, you always hear the story of like how Star Trek and other shows really did kind of foster and provide a foundation to kind of the technological advancements we've seen now and some of the scientific, discoveries that have been unearthed since. I think
It,
the
it's not only scientific evolution, but social evolution,
true, yeah.
because there was, this show we talked about, I stumbled on where Leonard Nimoy's son did a story about basically his biography of his father called The Search for Spock, and talked about how popular Spock was as a character um, in the 60s when the original series went on,
Hmm.
because he was, different, and uh, you had to accept that there was an alien species, and it just fit in with, you know, the social ideas really related to the hippie movement and so forth, where, racism was going to have to be more seriously dealt with. And, you need to look at peaceful coexistence and those sort of things.
Well, I think science fiction really does offer us, in some ways, a better roadmap culturally than I think some of the other social sciences do. And I'm not trying to demean things like, looking at history or economics or sociology or even religion or anything for kind of charting the course of how society changes. But I think the fidelity to which technology kind of followed along the path of kind of the cultural presentation that we were given in the 60s versus kind of the cultural presentations that we're given now about what the future may look like.
Well,
There's a big
science fiction, even though it's imaginary, it has a practicality to it.
exactly. Well, I think in some ways it gets back to something we've talked about in previous shows, ontology. I think
Mm-hmm.
that at some point, Gene Roddenberry and the producers of Star Trek designed this entire world and series of technology for the show. And in turn, the viewers watch that technology and watch the episodes of the show, and in the show, in turn, redesign them to go forward and create all of this new technology and find all of these new discoveries in the sciences to push things forward. I think a lot of the fiction that we are making now in science fiction um, speaks a lot to the possibility of faster than light travel. I think it speaks to things like being attached to maybe a greater. Uh, Elon Musk is working on something called a Neuralink, so I'm trying. It's late at night, so I'm trying to figure out a good way to
We've talked about this before, yes.
summarize what it is. Well, it fits with the episode because it gets to your question of are these organisms one consciousness? Um, so Elon Musk has this idea that he is going to basically hardwire a computer into your brain,
Mm-hmm.
and that computer will actually have a visual interface within your retina somehow, where what you see on the quote unquote screen that will be projected on the lens of your eye will help you manipulate whatever program or software you're running on the computer that's been essentially hardwired into your brain. Um, the application of this technology has huge, huge impacts in terms of not only like the cybernetic future of the human race, but the actual evolutionary future of the human race.
Mm-hmm.
You know, actually integrating man and machine changes us as a species in a gigantic way, and it brings up questions of not only like community and how we interact with each other, but also how we define ourselves individually.
Mm-hmm.
Um, with that being said, I think the interesting thing about these kind of organisms that we really never get a name to, we just know that they're from a distant part of the galaxy, is that it seems like there is a mother creature, and they're all kind of hardwired to return to the mother creature in a moment of danger. So there may be an aspect where they are all telepathically linked somehow in that sense. but it also seems like they're all individuals. Like they all use like singular identifiers like eyes and contractions and
Yeah,
stuff like that.
that's an important point and observation you're making, because one of my notes is, are these organisms like with the mother uh, organism, are they really like Borg? Are they proto Borg? And I don't think that's the case. But
Well,
one of the interesting things at the end, they said that there was some sort of homing signal sent out into the galaxy before Remick was killed and so forth. I'm thinking, okay, is that a setup for something else in the future, a
well,
future story?
so we're kind of jumping around, but this is a good place to jump to. So I love this episode, Conspiracy. I think we've highlighted that's a really simple narrative. I think it has
Mm-hmm.
really good acting. I think it has a lot of good action for a Star Trek episode this early on in the show. There's not a lot of like action in this first series. Um
Yeah, for instance, I think the when Quinn is on the Enterprise and he, tries to
the worst fight ever. The
convert.
worst fight ever. The
Well,
worst fight ever. What are those kicks that
I
like
know,
Riker throws these very weird kicks?
I know. At least they had a fight, and it involved Riker and Worf growls, and
And
then
Jordy.
Geordi comes in, and then Crusher comes in and saves the day and has her phaser set on kill, and not finally takes down Quinn.
Well, I thought that was a really good scene in terms of demonstrating, like, okay, this alien takes you over and you automatically get kind of this adrenal boost that gives you
Right.
like super strength and kind of mega endurance against pain.
Yes.
Like, okay, that makes them a real threat. I think the biggest issue is like this episode starts off with, you know, if you followed coming of age, you know these characters from beforehand and they've mentioned that something's wrong. This is the episode that we discover that something's wrong. And then we never ever hear about this storyline ever again.
It seems that way. That's right.
Well, like
Yeah.
they never talk about this. These creatures never return. This mother creature that they destroy that's living in the guts of Remick, and one of the more gorier scenes I think in any sci-fi show I've ever seen. Um, that this episode is kind of just presented as something that could be a real threat in the future and then just dropped completely. I know that there's going to be a changeover in season 2 when Gene Roddenberry leaves, but I wonder if this was in a plot that Gene Roddenberry had for later on in the future that just kind of got thrown to the wayside when the production
Mm-hmm.
team changed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because it's obvious that it's set up that they're going to face these people in the future, or that they're going to face this kind of organism in the future.
What about the aspect of Picard making a comment at the end about respecting all forms of life versus his decision to have to destroy it?
Gee,
Um,
so
I mean, this is not a prime directive issue or anything like that, because obviously there was a real threat to the Federation by the command structure being infected by these creatures and so forth. And he still showed a little bit of remorse in a sense that he had to, because of his respect for alien forms of life, that he had to destroy it, but he didn't have a problem making which was really a necessary decision to kill the mother creature and blow Remick to pieces.
I I think that Picard's moral moral difficulty here is on one hand, there's a clear and present danger to Starfleet.
Mhm.
It's not really made clear if it's a present danger to the Federation or Earth. And that kind of gets more into the creatures for a moment where they said, we've come a long way to join you. Even when Rem, you know, I would have shot Remick too when Remick is standing up and he says, "We're here, we want peaceful coexistence." I'm like, well, you don't yell violently at us when you say that.
That's right.
like,
Right.
like,
You're
say it.
saying one thing, but your tone is telling us something else.
Your tone doesn't match, my friend. So,
Well, here's a good segue. It's something I just thought of that, to bring this episode and what it represents into the present. You know, why is it that, like last night on Lester Holt NBC News, he's talking more about the military is now seriously concerned about a possible threat to national security of these films that Navy pilots and Air Force pilots are taking of, uh, I forget what they call it. They're not UFOs. They're not calling them unidentified flying objects. I can't what they're telling them.
yeah, they came up with a new term.
Yeah, and they're admitting that we really don't know what these are. We don't think they're drones that the Chinese or the Russians have developed because the anomalies that they see where they're going as fast as 11,000 miles an hour and they're making instantaneous 90-degree changes of course, which is things that have been reported about UFOs for decades now.
Yeah.
So it makes me think is why is the government releasing this and saying this? Are they trying to slowly prepare us to say, guess what? We really aren't alone. And we don't know where these things are coming from. We don't know what they represent. Thus, we're going to yellow alert at this point.
So, it's funny that we haven't really touched on something I wanted to touch on.
Oh, there was one other thing on the news report last night said, well, these objects are seen in the neighborhood of nuclear facilities. Well, guess what? They've always been around nuclear facilities. There's a story that who knows whether it's true that there was a IBM Minuteman site in Montana that was basically shut down years ago where an alien ship was hovering overhead. And there's the famous Bentwaters, England incident where the US was storing nuclear weapons in Britain. And, this craft, landed and all these Air Force security personnel observed it and so forth. Like, you're saying that, like, okay, they're messing around nuclear facilities. Well, yeah, they've been doing that for decades. Why is this getting paid attention to now?
Ancient Aliens has taken my father, y'all. No, in all seriousness, I think it's being paid attention to now, the same reason why we're paying attention to police violence. And before anyone at home leaps on me and saying, Jay, aliens and police violence aren't the same thing, it's like, no, I know they're not. Just hear me out. I think that with the widespread use of the internet and all of us having, you made the mention of Star Trek giving the inspiration to cellular flip phones. Well, flip phones are so outdated now that we don't use them. We're now, at the point of touchpad handsets for the smartphone technology. I think with the proliferation of all of us having smartphones, on top of all of us being connected to the internet, to where everyone can take, very high, relatively high resolution film and broadcast it kind of immediately to the world. We've had reports and we've had, journalism done about UFOs for decades now. I don't think that the government is necessarily as much getting us ready as they are just kind of coming clean with, there's definitely these flying objects in the sky that they can't explain. Or maybe they can, they're just not ready to explain it to us. If the latter's the case, I always fall on the side of I think humans are a lot more resolute and we're a lot more resilient, and I think we're a lot more able to accept things if you're just truthful with us about it.
Well, you bring up a good point in that I wonder if most modern, for instance, fighter aircraft, because I think
Hmm.
a lot of these UFOs have been basically pursued by fighter aircraft like F-14s,
Hmm.
F-16s, F-18s, and so forth, and probably with video capture technology. I wonder if it's just routine that all fighter aircraft has basically a gun camera because they don't need to have, they just need a little disk drive somewhere. They don't need film canisters like they had to do during World War II and so
Right. Well, all you need is like not even that. You just need a terabyte.
on. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
something you can plug into with the USB.
Right.
I think it is. I think there has always been this kind of acceptance that we're not alone in this universe. And I think you mentioned Roswell. I think going all the way back to Roswell, there's always been this sense that maybe not. And we're going to talk about the idea of conspiracies here in a second because I really want to touch on it. Because in
Sure.
2021, conspiracies actually have a lot
Mm-hmm.
of sway in our culture currently.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
the idea of aliens and somehow the government hiding it has been a long-standing conspiracy that I don't think is really much of a conspiracy anymore, as much as it is kind of, well, we know that the government is clearly never telling us everything that they could be telling us,
Mm-hmm.
and now with this kind of overwhelming evidence that there's these things in the sky that we can't explain. Um,
Let's
I
just
think
hope. Just let us hope that Jimmy Kimmel keeps interviewing every current or past president and asks, now what's the real story about the UFOs and
well,
the aliens?
I'm and this is where I sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist. I really do think that when we look at popular arts and entertainment in the mainstream today and how they're inexorably tied to um, not only a our news media apparatus, and I'm talking about publishing and entertainment being inexorably tied to our news media apparatus, but they're now inexorably tied to our governing apparatus too. It you make the joke of Jimmy Kimmel having former current and former presidents on the show to say like, haha, tell us the truth about aliens. But the truth is like Jimmy Kimmel has actually gone on and promoted government um I won't call it propaganda, but he has promoted government talking points. He's had government officials on. You know, our arts and entertainment is much a reflection of our government's messaging as the news is. And I think one of the reasons why you see everyone talking about UFOs now, I do think that the government does want to divulge something about the existence of extraterrestrials. I do think that they want to provide us an answer because at some point, if you don't provide an answer, someone else will.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't see I think the question everyone has about revealing whether or not extraterrestrials exist and if they're a force that we have to consider in our daily lives here on Earth is what do you gain by being the one who reveals it? Like, let's say you're China and you go on your state television, which is, of course, now connected to the global audience as well. Let's say you're the head of China and you go on and you say, well, we have proof of aliens and here's our proof and blah 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 blah. Okay, what does that get you? No, no, really. I'm asking you, like, and I'm asking anyone at home listening to this later on to really think about this. Like, what does it get you? What does it get you to say that you're? What does it get you to be the first to say that aliens are real and that they exist and that it's something that your government can't control or it's something that your government has no clue about? What does that get you? It's kind of admitting that you have strategic flaw or weakness by
Well,
coming out and saying like we don't know what these are, but we know that they're here.
I mean, it gets into, if the government basically certifies, look, these exist. Right now, what they're saying is they exist, but we
Mhm.
don't know what they are. So they're not saying they're aliens. If they came out and had evidence to say
Well,
these
are they
exist,
dragons, General? Are they dragons? Like what?
that they exist and we know they're aliens. I mean, if people really think about it, if they don't, if they don't land, if there's not a first contact event, then
Right.
how seriously will people take it? Because if they think about it, it's like, oh, we're not alone. So if, I mean, there's a future episode, a future season of Next Generation where um, Riker goes onto a planet that is close to their first warp event. And he's,
Right.
surgically altered, but he's discovered because he's injured. And, they, I lost my train of thought. But the leader, the head of this planet of society says, today I woke up thinking that I was like the most powerful person in the world. And
Right.
now I realize that I'm just, the leader of many voices that are out there. And I think that if there was an acknowledgement and an admission, without first contact, that these exist and we know that they're aliens and they provide evidence, then it's a real, it changes mankind's perception of itself. It's an
Yes.
evolution away from geocentrism, where the sun revolves around the earth, and we know it doesn't. And it even gets into spiritual and religious issues in terms of, well, we think we're unique because God put us here. But then if there's really, other
Exactly.
civilizations, other beings, again, if you don't have any first contact physical communication, but the leaders, um, a legitimate government says, look, we have evidence that they really are aliens. It changes our entire self-perception. Does it cause people, does it cause society to break down because, the foundations of what we believe about ourselves are found to be not real?
Right.
Or does it cause us to come together and realize, that Frank Borman was really right, that when he orbited the moon on Christmas Eve, 1968, and said, we're one small little blue dot out in space, which gives us the perception that, we really do need to work together because we have a very small home.
Mm-hmm.
And do we want to just, you know, fuck around with each other all the time with um, uh, silly political differences and so on? Or do we want to come together and, act as a species, which we really are?
Well, that it gets back to what we're talking about here. Um, the positive confirmation and revelation of aliens, I think, immediately throws a lot of the institutions that we are constantly relying on and taking for granted into immediate chaos.
Yes.
Like if there really is, they've identified multiple different types of these UFOs. Some of them are pill shaped, some of them are classic disc, some of them are orbs. All sorts of things. let's say for let's just suppose for a moment that they're all aliens. Let's just say that they're all different aliens and all these different ships belong to different species. Quickly, if there's multiple species of aliens that are just flying around Earth's skies, the idea of a nation flies right out the door. Like the
Mm-hmm.
idea of nationality flies right out the door. The
Mm-hmm.
idea of like state sovereignty flies right out the door. The idea of borders is basically gone. We keep fighting about the people flooding in on our southern border. If you have alien ships that basically violate our airspace at any given time, what is the use of a border? Like, what if you suddenly had like alien immigrants suddenly fleeing their planet, coming to
Well,
Earth because it's the best place for
I
them to
mean,
live?
here,
You can't stop them. So, like, it really does become this question of how we identify in terms of our human separations and our human categorizations of how we form our societies. All of that goes away.
well, three points. First of all, the new trendy name for UFOs is UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena.
Oh, that sucks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Second, in terms of aliens existing, when the first Men in Black came out, they showed all the big board of all the aliens, that were there. It showed Stallone and so forth. My sixth grade teacher's picture was up there for sure.
Yeah.
Third, um,
Oh, Men in Black. Yeah.
yeah, Men in Black. Geez, it's late. I'm losing my train of thought. What was I going to say? Hmm. It'll keep on going. It'll come back. It'll come back to me in a minute.
But, one thing that I kind of this episode touches on is the idea of conspiracies in themselves. Is that sometimes the conspiracies that we all believe to be true has no foundation in reality, and it's often the conspiracies that no one's paying attention to that have the real impact that we never see coming. um i I kind of think of, our government had warnings of 9/11 before it occurred. And by all accounts, that was a successful conspiracy that no one paid attention to, versus a whole host of other conspiracies that were going on at the time involving Russia, China, all sorts of different nation states. But I think the place that conspiracy has taken in our society, especially after the 4-year administration of Donald Trump and his support of his fan base called known as QAnon, I think that conspiracies have a very powerful effect and very powerful place in our social structure as it is in 2021. And I was wondering if you had any reflections on kind of how we're dealing with conspiracies today in our current culture, and just any general thoughts that you might have on them.
My only comment is thinking back. I mean, there was always, little conspiracies like, or little, mad stories and so forth. Like there was that cult in San Diego that thought there was this mother alien ship that was coming down, and they all did the mass suicide thing and so forth. Um, and yeah, kind of like Jim Jones and Jonestown and so forth. But for some reason, in the last decade, um, with so many potential our social and political evolution, people, because things have been changing so fast, they've, wanted to make up stories that just don't have any, um, basis. There's no evidence for it and so forth. They make this stuff up because they want to control people politically.
Yeah.
And I can't remember going back, beyond 10 years that you had really crazy shit is the only way to say it, like we have now. And it's very dangerous. Um, I mean, the whole thing that keeps going on with that the election was stolen, you
Hmm.
know, there's, conservative Republican entities that just won't let that die.
I think reflecting on what you just said, I think a lot of conspiracies come from a place of trying to explain something that is relatively simple, but some people simply won't accept.
Acceptance is the key. Yes,
Like,
right.
for example, a big conspiracy that we both grew up with, and still, you know, um, in the society venture to wonder at is, like, for example, the Kennedy assassination.
I
There's
was just,
been,
I knew that you were going there. Yeah.
President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas in 1960
63,
63.
November 22nd.
And, most people have concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald made this really good shot from this book depository and killed the president that way. There are some people who think that he was shot from a second gunman on a knoll within sight of the assassination. And then there are some people who believe that Oswald fired a magic bullet. And there's also many conspiracies about who's actually involved in ordering the assassination, from Lyndon B. Johnson to the Russians to the Cubans to the mob.
The
And then I think,
CIA, right? Yeah.
and the
Even,
CIA, and I think
right.
aliens are involved in that too. I don't think.
Probably. Right.
Oh, and the Fed. I actually think, if we're going to be venturing a guess on who killed Kennedy, I think the Fed killed Kennedy because he wanted to close them down.
Yeah,
But
you've said that before. My vote is for the mob.
yeah,
The mob did it.
oh yeah, I think the mob was probably involved. You want to know my real big conspiracy, Dad?
Go ahead.
The Fed is the mob.
It could be, right.
Well, no, okay, like
We've talked
here's
about this before.
but
Yeah.
here's how conspiracies really work. And I think that this is instructive for people at home for a second, because I've always thought that it was crazy that Republicans in the last 4 years believed that Democrats were running child pedophile sex rings out of pizza parlors in Washington D.C., which seems like a very inopportune place to run your childhood pedophile sex operation. But they it sounds like conspiracy theory to say that government, um, Fortune 500 corporations, and the military industrial complex are all working together in concert to bilk the American people for their taxpayer dollars and increase wealth inequality. Like, to say that out loud to Republicans or to certain people, that sounds like a conspiracy. But the idea that the government blew up the two towers during 9/11 is somehow this completely plausible thing. I really do think that sometimes the conspiracy is more exciting than the actual truth, because the truth in itself is sometimes devastating to accept. Um, I think Picard, when he comes down to Earth, I think and I know this is a roundabout way to getting back to your point about his the preservation of life versus the action he has to take. I think you see this entity clearly come in and foist itself and its will upon all the other living sentient beings in Starfleet. And I think Picard sees this and goes, well, if they're willing to do that without permission, what are they going to do when they finally get me or Riker or Beverly or any other crew, or
Hmm.
what happens?
Hmm.
And I think he takes kind of a decision in the immediate to look ahead and go, well, this is clearly not going to go well, and kills the mother creature. I think the truth there is that when he finally sees the conspiracy for what it is, he realizes how devastating it is, and he acts. And I think this is where the division between the real world and fiction occurs. I think, you know, I don't think it's conspiracy theory to say that the forces of the military industrial complex, our government, and Fortune 500 corporations here in New York City, primarily centered in Wall Street and in London, are working in concert to make more money and divide us and increase wealth and inequality. That doesn't seem to me to be a conspiracy theory. We have tons of journalism, we have tons of witness testimony. We just kind of know that this is a real thing that's going on. But it's taken heaven and earth to get any real action or movement going against this, and where Picard can just aim his phaser and take care of the problem. Here in the real world, to deal with a real life conspiracy that's there in front of our faces that we can't deny, seems at some points to be this really insurmountable kind of challenge that we're never going to get over. Versus, it's easy to sit here and talk about the conspiracy of 9/11 or talk about the conspiracy of QAnon and how, Democrats are secretly trying to take over, I I guess something that you're doing in your bedroom. I don't know, but there's real things that I think we face every day that fall into the category, I think, conspiracy that we just don't talk about. And it gets to the point I think those admirals are making, it's the stuff that you're never paying attention to that's the real problem. It's the stuff that you always think is going on that's never anything to take seriously. And I think this episode really kind of highlights that kind of lesson well, kind of in the real
Mhm,
world.
mhm.
Um, Folks, it's running late for both Jake and I. Dad, I would like to let you end the episode. Is there anything that you would like to discuss right before we go, or
No, I don't have anything else really.
okay? So before we go, how do you like this episode? Where do you think it falls into the season? We're actually at the end. We're actually almost at the very end of the season. We have one more episode to go.
Uh, I'd rate it in, I'd put it in the top 10.
Yeah, me too. I
Mhm,
think it's a really good episode. I think the acting's good.
mhm.
Um, I think,
Interesting story.
yeah, absolutely, an interesting story. Uh, Mentioning the next episode that we are going to be covering, which is the finale of the first season, Star Trek: The Next Generation episode, season 1, episode 26, the Neutral Zone. Um, the only thing that I would like to say is that this episode feels like an actual season finale, where next week doesn't feel like the end of a season at all.
Yeah, having watched the last episode, the neutral zone, the only way where it becomes transitional is some of the words that Picard says at the very end. That kind
Yeah.
of says we still have things to do. There's things to learn and so forth. So that. I mean, you're right. There's no end to season one a story that continues into the next season. You're
Well,
right.
this one kind of feels like an end of season 1 episode, because even the very ending where you see
Yeah,
the ship kind of pass by and then
right.
you hear the signal going off in the space and
Yes,
they
it
kind of
it, it
pan
could be for
deeper.
that reason. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it feels like the end of
Right.
this should have been the end of the series.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
But on that, thank you everyone for joining us. We will see you next time for Star Trek The Next Generation season 1 episode 26, The Neutral Zone. Thanks for joining me, Dad.
Thanks, Jay. Good night.
Good night.